Okay, hello everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining us. My name is Tom Langford and I'm the security advocate at Sentinel One. I'm pleased to introduce you to today's event, Cyber War and Cyber Peace, Past and Future Cyber Clashes in the Middle East. I think the word cyber is one that we'll be using an awful lot today, so please get used to it. The cyber domain is no longer a new frontier of conflict, as we know. Many battles in cyberspace have been fought and opportunities have risen to study the history of cyber warfare in the Middle East and examine policy challenges that will arise throughout the forthcoming Joe Biden's presidency. This panel will feature several chapter authors who contributed to the cyber program's anthology book, Cyber War and Cyber Peace in the Middle East, available from all good booksellers, I'm reliably informed. The recently launched book seeks to chronicle the history of the cyber domain and the unique geopolitical setting of the Middle East, and to offer policy proposals that can make it more peaceful and an equitable space. It can be purchased on Amazon, as I say. This panel is sponsored by Sentinel One, a cybersecurity solution encompassing AI-powered prevention, detection, response, and hunting in a single autonomous platform. I'm now pleased to introduce our expert panel who will discuss the past, present, and future challenges in cyber conflict. Firstly, we have Selena Larson. Selena is a senior cyber threat analyst at Dragos Inc. She works to combat fear, uncertainty, and doubt surrounding malicious activity, targeting ICS environments, and help people better understand complex concepts and behaviors. Hello, Selena.
Hello, Tom. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to MEI for sponsoring today's event.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm really looking forward to this. Next, we have James Shires. James is an assistant professor at the Institute for Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University in the Netherlands. His research examines cybersecurity in the Middle East, focusing on the interaction between threats to individuals, states, and organizations, new regional dynamics, and the development of cybersecurity expertise. Hello, James.
Hi, and great to be here. Thanks to MEI. Thanks for hosting this. And I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad you're both looking forward to it because we've got an hour to fill. So for our listeners and watchers out there, please do submit your questions to us. Otherwise, this is just going to be the opinions and thoughts of three people rather than all of you. So please, let's crowdsource some Q&A. To submit your questions, you can use Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can find on your Zoom screens. I believe it's at the bottom to the right. Your mileage may vary on that advice, though. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. And you can also use that email address, events@mei.edu, if you have any technical issues. Please don't ask me. I've got no clue. Feel free to ask a question at any time throughout the panel. I'm going to be looking for your questions as well as wrangling our two professionals on today's panel. And I'll factor as many of these into the conversation as possible. So, Selena and James. So, Selena, please tell us a little bit more about yourself and your perspective, the perspective that you'll be bringing to today's conversation.
Sure. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Like Tom said, my name is Selena. I am the senior cyber threat analyst at Dragos. Dragos is an industrial cybersecurity company. So my team, the intelligence team, focuses on cyber threats specifically to industrial control systems and operational technologies. When we talk about ICS, that really encompasses things like oil and gas, critical manufacturing, electric utilities, water treatment facilities, things that are made, things that can go boom, things that are controlling the lights and the automobiles in our environment. So what we've seen is that the Middle East in particular is among the most active for adversaries that are targeting critical infrastructure. And specifically, we discuss in the book, focusing largely on the Trisis malware. And this is very interesting in particular due to the fact that this was the first ICS-specific malware that was able to target safety instrumented systems at an oil and gas facility. And what that means is it targeted the equipment that is designed to keep people and the environment safe. So today I'll kind of be contributing from the perspective of industrial control system cybersecurity, some of the threats that we're seeing, how that impacts both entities in the Middle East, as well as potentially bringing the conversation to talk about here in United States, North America as well. And happy to answer any questions about that particular threat landscape.
Excellent, thank you. I love the industrial control systems, stopping your systems from going boom. I think is probably one of the most accurate summaries of an ICS I've heard to date. James, over to you. Please tell us a little bit more about your experience and expertise in this particular field.
Sure. So hi everyone, and I'm an academic, sort of trying to bring a variety of sort of theoretical social science and other perspectives to understand more about how cybersecurity issues have developed worldwide, but especially in the Middle East region and in the States, where I've done a lot of my own research in Egypt and the Gulf states, the states of the Gulf Cooperation Council. So I've been looking at various cybersecurity issues there for what is scarily close to a decade now. So we might be talking about some of the cyber incidents that popped up when I was new to the region's cybersecurity, and maybe they look like long history now for a lot of people. So it's been amazing to see how this conversation has changed over time. The publication of this book and the fantastic people that have contributed to it is a marker of that. I'm really happy to be involved. I'm also trying to communicate my own research at the moment as well. So my work on the politics of cybersecurity in the Middle East will be coming out shortly next year. And that has a more sort of in-depth look at some of the things that Tom mentioned earlier about cybersecurity expertise, about how various cybersecurity communities understand the threats they face and how they try and respond to them. So there's plenty to talk about, from industrial control systems to disinformation. And my chapter in the Middle East Initiative book, Middle East Institute book, is on disinformation in the Gulf. So I'm happy to go in that direction as well if we want to. So plenty to cover, and I look forward to saying more.
Excellent, thank you. Never miss a chance to hawk your own book, I say.
Academics will be academics, right?
Yeah, exactly. Available from all good booksellers, I'm sure. Excellent. So I've got a list of questions here. Obviously, I'm keeping an eye on the Q&A, but let's start by going back to what many might consider the beginning of cyber warfare as we understand it. So some point to Stuxnet as not only the start of cyber warfare in the Middle East, but probably everywhere, given that it was the first time that a piece of malicious code had been weaponized to target a specific piece of ICS, industrial control system, technology, and to do physical damage. Is that an accurate assessment of Stuxnet?
Yeah, so I'll hop on this first, I guess. It is for sure. At the time, it was really unprecedented that the malware was able to sort of disrupt the uranium production in Iran. It was able to sort of hobble or cripple the production of nuclear weapons. That was largely sort of the main focus of it, right? So you have this code, this piece of malware that hadn't been seen before. It was extremely sophisticated and very complicated, using a number of 0 days, right? So we're talking about pieces or vulnerabilities in code that were unknown to anyone except for the attackers, that were able to sort of leverage that and implement that. And it was this real watershed moment at the time for the sort of realization of the capabilities and the potential consequences that sort of weaponized malware. We kind of use the term of the first sort of massive cyber weapon, right? Which I feel like the term cyber weapon is kind of thrown around haphazardly these days. But I would consider Stuxnet certainly to fall into that category. And so it was really kind of this moment where we're like, oh, okay, like this can be used, like cyber is not just, the us being on the internet. It's not just the sort of Internet of Things or enabling, whether it's, industrial control systems or, our Facebook, MySpace, whatever at the time. But it is, really these capabilities can be used and exploited to have some pretty significant consequences on a huge, massive national scale.
Mm. James, do you remember where you were when you first heard about Stuxnet?
I do, but I want to focus on maybe a bit of disagreement if we can.
Please,
because,
I welcome.
Stuxnet is possibly the most talked about cyber operation. It's known not only to those of us who work in the industry and on the subject, but to most people outside of it as well. And for me, there are three really interesting angles of disagreement about how to interpret Stuxnet, about what it means for cyber conflict more broadly. The first one is actually well illustrated by the name itself, right? Do you call it Stuxnet, this piece of industrial control systems malware, this ICS malware, or do you call it Olympic Games, right? The operation that was designed by the US intelligence agencies that fitted into a whole load of other anti-Iran counter-proliferation efforts designed to prevent them getting this nuclear weapon and attributed to the Israelis as well. So even this Olympic Games versus Stuxnet tells you sort of what community you're in, how you're interpreting. Is it a threat to industrial control systems, or is it a US-Israeli operation against Iran in a geopolitical sense? Of course, it's both, but people focus on different sides of it. The second one is, was it effective? Right? And I've seen completely different views on this, right? In terms of, did it actually slow down the Iranian nuclear program at a strategic level? Did it destroy the number of centrifuges? Did it make them inoperable in the way that it claimed to? How many did they have to replace, switch out because of this program? Was it discovered too early so it didn't have an effect? Or actually there was several different versions that replaced each other over time, and so maybe it was really effective because it wasn't discovered for a long period of time, right? So this effectiveness at different levels is something that I've seen lots of people who have studied the matter in detail disagree on. And then finally is this question of sort of in what way is sort of Stuxnet representative of cyber weapons out of control, right? Is it something that sort of spread around the world, that it was designed to be in this nuclear facility, but actually was discovered on systems all over the world in Eastern Europe, India, and so on? Or is it something that was extremely well controlled? Because even though it was in all these other systems, it didn't do anything, right? It would not trigger, it would not sort of start itself working until it actually found the specific fingerprints of this facility. So some people have said that Stuxnet was designed by lawyers, right? That it was very carefully put together to
was the code
prevent
really long?
Yeah, exactly. It was very expensive as well.
It was very expensive, about $5 million as I understand it.
Yeah, there we go. So it's designed by lawyers in many ways. But that tells you that maybe actually there's a lot of control, a lot of limitations that went into it, not the kind of stuff where it's sort of, this is spiraling, around the world with lots of different consequences.
It's very interesting because I think the estimate was that it took out about 20% of Iran's enrichment capability. Now, not knowing a huge amount about the nuclear material enrichment process myself, 20% doesn't sound like much, but it could have been the critical mass. It could have been enough that actually stopped everything else from going forwards, or it could have been just, as you say, stopped far too early. We just don't know. And given that it was the first of its kind, at least in our terms, we probably never will know.
Exactly. And then you get into discussions, when you talk about 20%, things like that, you get into, well, what kinds of centrifuges were these? There were some really old kinds that Iran had that didn't work very well to begin with. There were the newer kinds that were much more efficient. What were the proportion they had of them? Which ones did it target? That kind of stuff, right? So these counterfactuals, these hypotheticals about effect are really difficult to answer. And you can bet that the people who designed the code were really trying to answer it as well. It's not just the people who are looking at it like us from the outside. The people who are on the inside, they want to know whether it's effective, because if they have a choice between, say, a airstrike or a cyber attack, you want to know what the consequences are of each one. You want to know what the effect is. So people on the inside would have been as interested in that question as we are.
And the collateral damage, as you say, any kind of kinetic attack, it brings about collateral damage, which is, obviously unacceptable for a variety of reasons. But, certainly the collateral damage of Stuxnet, where we see it all over the place, and the code being laid bare as well, that who knows what may happen. I mean, it's been 10 years. It's unlikely something will have, it will have evolved into something else, but it's certainly gone to all four corners of the world. So we've got plenty of questions actually, which is excellent. Oh my goodness. Quite an audience. So one of the first one that came in, which is from Magan Singodia. Thank you, Magan. It talks about recent signing by UAE and Bahrain to normalize relationships with Israel, talking about the Abraham Accords there. How significant is the reason for this signing due to cyber concerns by the two Arab countries? And if so, how dominant will Israel's influence become in the region and further afield? I am assuming here that Israel is one of the leader in cyber technologies. I think that's a very, very good question. But as I understand it, the Abraham Accords covered more than just the cyber world. They cover everything, industrial, agricultural, engineering, etc. But cyber is definitely one of the key aspects here. What do you think is going to be the real impact here? Is there going to be a far more egalitarian approach between the signatories of the Abraham Accords, or are they going to sort of is there going to become an imbalance as a result of this, or an even greater imbalance, one might say?
Yeah. So I can take this first if you want, and then
Please.
You can come in. So yeah, it's a really great question, and it's one that is definitely on the top of people's minds at the moment. The Abraham Accords, these series of normalization agreements with Israel, the Arab world, are a landmark occasion, right? This is something that is a sea change in the geopolitics of the region, but especially in the Gulf, we need to be careful to understand it for the nuance that we can give to it, rather than the sort of headlines and maybe the hype that goes around, right? And my underlining take on this would be that this brings into the open something that was already happening, right? This is not a sort of peacemaking between two sides that were at war. These are relationships that are economic, that are political, that were already existing, right, in lots of different sectors, but especially in cybersecurity sectors. These are now coming out into the open, and that is being enabled by these normalization agreements. So there will be an increase, and we've already seen that already. We've seen lots of Israeli business people and companies go to UAE and start discussions, especially on cybersecurity technologies. But it's not that the UAE or other Gulf countries weren't already having close undercover relationships with Israel in cybersecurity. We already know there's public reporting on spyware companies like NSO Group, for example, where they're selling to the Gulf states and many other ones around the world. So Israel has already been exporting its leading, its world-leading technology in cybersecurity, but that might decrease over time. The other thing I want to say here is that it represents, from my position as looking at cybersecurity expertise, it represents a move away from, say, the Gulf states relying on Europe and the US as sources of their cybersecurity expertise, big defense companies, things like that. The UAE has tried really hard to grow its own cybersecurity expertise. It's even created a defense conglomerate, Edge, very recently, to try and bring this stuff into its sort of national borders. And this maybe marks the regionalization with the UAE, with Israel, away from Europe and US, as well as changing the dynamic in the region itself.
Selena.
So yeah, James does make a great point in terms of Israel's sort of cyber capabilities and the way that they have become this sort of stalwart in the area. They have, a lot of very, very smart companies. You mentioned NSO. There are, a handful of cyber weapons companies, or I guess hacking companies, depending on how you want to sort of phrase that.
Depends which side of the fence they sit on legally, I guess.
Exactly. Well, and who their customers are, and who whatever your perspective you're bringing to examining those entities and organizations. But to your point too, it was sort of this like landmark agreement, right? It impacted and touched on a lot of different, for instance, agriculture and critical infrastructure certainly being a part of that, right? There was I saw some coverage discussing the water in the region, the sort of the water rights and how that will be used and distributed. And what we've also seen too is in recent months, there has been some targeting of, for instance, water systems in Israel. Certainly, messing and examining programmable logic controllers that are very impactful and important in controlling water from both an agricultural perspective as well as just like a human use case. So I think to your point, I think that this is bringing some stuff into the light. It might be interesting from an adversary perspective. Anytime that you see these sort of agreements on a sort of bubble up to become very solidified and organized, whether it's trade agreements or some of the economic and critical infrastructure projects that we see with China, for instance, and the different targeting of entities that are involved in those from potentially adversaries that may not necessarily benefit or might be impacted by those agreements. So I think it might be kind of interesting to see not just the sort of impact of the participating entities, but whether or not, some of the adversaries that might be interested in disrupting potentially these peace agreements or kind of seeing if they are able to sort of manipulate or have some sort of conflict targeting those that are a part of it. So that's certainly something to watch from the cyber sort of threat perspective.
Mm-hmm. Now I'm going to touch on this hopefully more later if we get time, but I just want to touch on it quickly now. But following on from these accords and something you mentioned, James, is more sort of cyber intelligence or cyber capability now being bought in-house by Bahrain, Sudan, the UAE, etc., as a result of these accords? So rather than having to outsource a lot of their capabilities or to buy in services from outside, they're now able to sort of, as a result of this, grow their own far more.
Yeah, there's a few different angles to this to unpack, right? It's a really complex question, especially if you're a leader or decision maker trying to think, well, I want to have these cyber capabilities. Maybe you've seen the Snowden revelations, you've seen what the US has done, and you say, like,
yeah,
I want to
have
keep
some
that,
of that,
right? Exactly. So, and then how does the strategic question sort of unpack itself, right? Well, maybe you could outsource this, and the Gulf states especially have a long history of working closely with very different parts of the world, from South Asia to Europe and the US, to bring lots of technologies in. And they've had struggled with this in some senses in terms of the broader labor market, right? In terms of nationalization policies, trying to bring more expertise, trying to give more jobs to nationals, to citizens of the Gulf states, rather than having expatriates or other workers come and do them for them. So if cybersecurity in this sense and cyber expertise fits into this broader sort of labor market trend. But in terms of being in-house, and especially when we're talking about offensive cyber capabilities, right? Geneva said that cyber weapons is maybe not the best term. I'm going to use a slightly more cumbersome offensive cyber capabilities because I think it's more accurate. We can talk about that later if we want to. But if you want to bring these in-house, there are some specific things that states start to worry about. The first might be export regulation, right? And there is a growing body of export regulation on these capabilities for two reasons. One is national security. The states aren't necessarily happy if maybe their adversaries, if people that they're not getting on with on the geopolitical scene, get access to the same capabilities they do. They're investing heavily in them. They want to use them for intelligence, for maybe manipulation, controlling the information environment. They don't want their adversaries to be able to do the same thing. So there are strong national security rationales for states to control these exports. there are also human rights reasons as well. Right? And some of the export regulation specifically focuses on controlling spyware and other technologies for human rights reasons, prevent association with human rights violations. And many of the examples of these uses from the early regulations, so the Wassenaar Arrangement going back maybe 5 or 7 years ago now, were drawn from the Gulf states. Now, the EU, for example, is continuing to update its export regulation. This is changing very, very rapidly to include facial recognition and other technologies. So we are already talking about the real gamut of cyber defense stuff, whatever you put in that bucket. So you have to think about export regulation and whether you can actually get hold of the most advanced technologies in the first place. And then the other question is this one of actually, do you have more control if you have this stuff in-house, right? Not only is there a national security and an export level relationship, there's also commercial relationships. How much are you paying for these technologies? What sort of contractual arrangements? Can these companies go and sell them elsewhere? Who owns the intellectual property? This kind of stuff is actually gets quite complicated when you get down to the detail of it. And there are other reasons there to bring this in-house, just in terms of the commercial side of it as well and the market-based side.
Yeah, James, I think you've been looking at my notes because you covered a few things there anyway. But nonetheless, excellent points, especially, again, one I was going to touch on later, and perhaps Selena, you could comment on about the rise of, I think it's termed digital authoritarianism. So digital authoritarianism, as a result of this bringing in the house of these capabilities to exert control and suppress dissent within, within populations. Is that a very real risk? And actually, and this is going to tie into the next question that's been asked, is that something that we should be concerned about?
Sure. So real quick, I think so, yes. And I know that James can probably talk a little bit more about the, sort of authoritarianism piece and the impact of these, cyber capabilities might have on, the citizens of various countries. But from the perspective of developing and having these types of cyber capabilities, I actually kind of want to push back a little bit on what James said in terms of the sophistication or, getting the ability to have these, types of weapons, offensive capabilities, for example. What we're seeing is a sort of proliferation of that can be sort of mirrored to, the physical weapons proliferation, but you're seeing a lot of these tools sort of make the rounds in the cyber realm. And when it comes to what we're seeing from a lot of advanced persistent threat actors, APT groups, right? You do have things like Stuxnet, for instance, or Trisis, for example, but you also have a lot of just very sort of basic, well, I don't want to say necessarily basic, right? But traditional common hacking tools, right? You have this sort of proliferation of hacking tools that are available open source. You can buy things very, very easily on various markets, darknet markets. You can look on YouTube for various tutorials about how to use all this stuff. And you have, for example, Metasploit. You have these sort of hacking frameworks that are adopting, for instance, ICS-specific capabilities for hacking critical infrastructure. So you have this sort of more availability of this stuff in open source, whereas I feel like historically it took a lot more sort of investment and effort into developing, offensive cyber capabilities. Whereas now you can just like download a framework and sort of, target the victims from a very, one simple workstation, right? When it comes to sort of ICS, or when it comes to sort of more hyper-targeted activities with a very specific consequence, certainly if we're talking like, for instance, NSO group or hyper-targeting dissidents, there are, individuals that are going to be a little bit more susceptible to more very advanced, sophisticated tools. But from a sort of espionage attacks or that sort of more strategic hacking, you have, all of these countries now have these capabilities. And I think Chris Krebs actually said a couple of years ago, it's like, if all these countries are trying to do this, right, if they don't have these sort of, advanced, capabilities, these hacking capabilities, and they're not trying. So I think it is something, that we're seeing regardless of, what's going on with the Accords that you had mentioned, or, some other, geopolitical activities going on. Certainly, whether that's kinetic wartime or sort of what we're talking about with espionage and certainly like recently, SolarWinds. But you do have this sort of, they're able to sort of get their hands on these things and potentially execute attacks much easier than they were historically able to.
Yeah.
So yeah, down to James to talk about the authoritarianism.
Yeah.
Thanks for leaving me the easy question, Selena. So yeah, I just want to add on to that, and yeah, I think Selena's absolutely right. We need to think about the use of capabilities, not just in terms of the sort of high-end stuff, the sophisticated malware, but also like traversing networks using stuff that's already there, right? Using like privileges like passwords and things, and user credentials that you can just get hold of, and then pretending to be those users, right? That's not it requires any 0 days. It doesn't require sophistication, but it is very effective, right? We see everyone do that as well. And also just these open source tools, right? To move away from the Gulf for a bit, we've seen, if you follow the sort of cyber landscape of the Syrian conflict, right? You saw lots of different forms of malware emerging in the Syrian conflict. You saw things like NJ-RAT and Black Shades come up and then be used by lots of different kinds of actors targeting the opposition, probably associated with the regime, that kind of thing. And then, that's because they were open source. That's because you could just find them and implement them yourself. So, there is this real proliferation out there. In terms of authoritarianism, now this is where the sort of political science framing comes in. I start putting my hat on and get back into the sort of classroom style, where you think about, well, why are we having these sort of really controversial debates around espionage and spyware, right? And when they get to human rights violations, I think one of the questions mentioned targeting journalists, things like this, right? We can only really understand these conversations and these trajectories if we know how authoritarianism is changing. By authoritarianism, we mean sort of forms of political power that are not evenly spread, that are not democratic, that don't sort of allow for individual rights and freedoms, right? And if you have that kind of political power, which many would say the Gulf states exemplify, especially in the digital format, you then have people looking to exert this power in the online space, right? And that naturally leads them to gathering information on what they see as threats, right? So this recent example, the Al Jazeera journalist, right? The Citizen Lab report says that these are journalists. We need to protect their freedom of expression, right? This is a very important job. You might have the defense from the UAE saying that we saw this as like a threat in the context of the Gulf crisis, right? The split between these different states, right? And they named Al Jazeera as one of the reasons for this 2017 split in the first place, right? As a major national security threat, right? So they immediately have this difference in perspectives, and you can only understand this difference in perspectives once you understand the democratic or the authoritarian wider context in which these technologies sit. And then the last thing I'd say is when we're talking about digital authoritarianism, we're not just talking about censorship or filtering. These are things that have happened, in the Gulf states, but elsewhere as well for many years, and not just on the internet. But we're also talking about information manipulation, right? So once you see that social media is very prevalent, once you see that there is an online public sphere, it's very important for all states, and maybe we're seeing a reflection of this in the US over the last election, that maybe the information sphere gets slightly out of control. And you have states and other non-state actors, foreign and domestic, try to exert power over it.
It's fake news, apparently.
I believe so.
We are awash with questions from our audience, so thank you very much, audience. So Malcolm Wah, thank you, Malcolm. Middle East indigenous culture can be very different from Western cultures and ways of seeing, doing things. How does the panel see the Arab viewpoint in the cyber domain, and does the panel value the Arab contribution to cyber protection and defense in the Middle East? It's a very interesting question. The fact that we often will look at any particular challenge through our own lens, without taking into account, other, cultures and viewpoints. Selena, I saw you nodding vigorously there. What's your response to that?
Yeah, so, I think that obviously we would like, Western societies to sort of project our own standards of cybersecurity and our own sort of rules, regulations, whatever. We do things perfect, so you should try and do that as well. But I would say we don't actually. And what's interesting, though, is you are seeing a lot of these Middle Eastern countries sort of adopt cybersecurity standards and rules and regulations. I am going to talk about it from the sort of critical infrastructure perspective, as that's where my knowledge is, and less about the sort of spyware hacking side of things. But a great example would be the Trisis attack that impacted a Saudi Arabia oil and gas facility. And following that attack, I believe it was so the attack occurred in 2017. In 2018 or 2019, Saudi Arabia actually adopted new cybersecurity protections that included very specifically a regulation to sort of isolate safety instrument systems in your environment. So you have a couple other countries, I believe Bahrain might be one, that also have these sort of national cybersecurity standards that sort of govern, the whether it's critical infrastructure, government sort of networks, and largely how we do here in the U.S. as well. But you have, Qatar, Bahrain, UAE, and now, Saudi Arabia that have these sort of cybersecurity standards in place to sort of protect themselves from foreign adversaries targeting their networks.
James.
Yeah, and so I think this is a really great question. And maybe the first thing to say is that we're not the best people to answer, right? And what we should have is another panel with people from Saudi Arabia and from the UAE talking as well on their perspective, right? Because so we can't answer this on the Arab perspective. But maybe I'll just give a quick anecdote just to illustrate how I start thinking about this. Because yes, the first danger is that outsiders, right, people from say the Europe and the US go to the Gulf, and they're sort of imposing their views about how organizations or cultures work on the people they're working with. But the next danger is to worry about some sort of indigenous or different culture as like an essential quality, right? And then you say, well, actually, no, we can't do this because of this cultural aspect, or we can't do that because of something different, right? And maybe a good example here is less controversial than the spyware hacking stuff. It's maybe less boom-like than the critical infrastructure, but it is very simple. It's data breaches, right? So in my research on cybersecurity, I've talked a lot about data breaches from companies and organizations, just the standard kind of stuff, right? Where things get posted online, or they see things that they didn't want to appear, like get exfiltrated from their system, right? In the US, for example, you might say, well, there's a real economic reason for this happening, right? The companies just don't, they're not incentivized to protect their systems, right? They don't have these like market reasons. They're not sharing information about how to protect them properly, right? This is an economic problem. Often the consultants or the experts you talk to, especially in the Gulf, will say, well, this is an economic problem. This is a cultural thing, right? It's very hard to get people to talk to you about this kind of stuff. They won't claim that they've been breached because this is a privacy thing, right? It's all about like this Arab notion, Middle East notion of privacy. I think that's really dangerous, right? To say that this is economically motivated in the US and it's sort of culturally motivated in the Arab world, right? What we need to think is that, yes, there are different cultural and social assumptions that people bring to the table, but they do vary depending on context. And another great one is on individual privacy, right? You see research looking at how young Saudi teenagers use social media apps when they're in Saudi Arabia and when they're in the US. And surprisingly enough, it turns out that they don't just use them in the same way wherever they are. They actually vary, right? So if they're in Saudi Arabia, they will tweet stuff differently. They will share stuff differently. And in the US, they'll behave differently, right? So these notions of sort of social or cultural privacy or sharing, these are contextual. And so it's a really important thing to look at, but it's something we can't really treat simply. So that's also dangerous.
It's definitely a three-dimensional perspective that we need to look at this. It's not a simple, it either is or it isn't. There's so many different inputs into something like this. Thank you.
But the only thing that we can definitely say is a good thing is getting more voices in there, right? So having more people working in the region, coming, exchanging knowledge, having them come to the MEI and things like that, that is also always going to help.
Yeah, absolutely. We have another question from Suzanne Rothman. Are there efforts to create regional or global legal frameworks that would define what sorts of cyber actions would be considered acts of war or would act as a Geneva Convention for cybersecurity. This is very interesting. As I was preparing, questions yesterday and today, questions which I don't need anymore because we've got so many from the audience. But as I was preparing questions, I was likening. I listened to a podcast which interviewed Richard E. Clarke, who was the cyber czar for some time in the US. And he mentioned about how he brought in at some point, missile treaty in a previous role, missile treaty thing, and how you import and export regulations on missiles, etc., and how he felt that actually that should be transferred to the cyber world. And the fact that we should have these frameworks and we should have the acceptable uses of these technologies, etc. Is that even possible when actually the world in which they operate is global by its very nature, the internet? So
I can start if you like, Selena.
Oh, okay. No, whoever jumps in first, go for it.
So I'm just vigorously nodding along.
Yeah.
But I think, this could be an entire webinar all on its own.
Yeah. Every question could be, in fairness, so far, right? It's
exactly. Well, and I think it's really interesting because you hear this talk of the sort of digital Geneva Convention fairly often from a lot of different resources. Personally, I think it is possible and it should be established. I do think that we do have to start, establishing some of these sort of norms and laws. And I come from, again, critical infrastructure perspective, right? Like the malware that we've seen has been able to potentially kill people, have complete blackouts due to cyber attacks. And then if you kind of think of the cascading consequences of that, okay, hospitals not having electricity, people at home not having electricity to have, specific ventilators or things, right, that are very, very fundamental. And there have been a number of organizations that have tried to take a stab at this. So Microsoft is an example that I like to use a lot. And they tried to establish a sort of digital convention policy paper back in 2017 to say, okay, here are the sort of rules and regulations that we believe should be in existence for, participating entities and countries all over the world to say, here is like operating within the bounds of okay cyber activity and operating outside the bounds of okay cyber activity. And for me, the most important thing is targeting of civilians versus targeting military or government establishments and entities, because there's sort of like a blurred line, right? Like cyber as a domain is not like a sort of the same, domain of warfare that you see in sort of more of a kinetic setting, right? Like we're all on the cyber domain, right? We're currently talking on Zoom on the cyber domain.
It's totally interconnected. It's very difficult to extract.
Right. And so to sort of like draw the line in the sand between what's acceptable and what's unacceptable, I think is very, very important. And when you're talking about lives lost, when you're talking about cybersecurity as a humanitarian issue, and on that, the International Committee of the Red Cross has also done a lot of work in this, is saying, okay, like when a cyber attack becomes a humanitarian issue, how should the International Committee respond to that? And although I actually talk about this quite a bit in the chapter that I wrote for the Cyber War and Cyber Peace in the Middle East book, but a good example of the impact that disrupting critical infrastructure can have on humans and society is in Venezuela, when they had mass blackouts last year that were not a result of a cyber attack, but the infrastructure was in a pretty bad shape, pretty bad way, and had mass blackouts all over the country. There was a lot of very humanitarian cost there. People suffered, humans suffered, people, died or potentially could have died as a result of this. And the Red Cross actually did send folks there to help with the recovery due to this sort of critical infrastructure outage. And so I think that despite that not being related to a cyber attack, we can see the potential consequences of entire, grid networks going down or, catastrophic cyber attacks that impact fundamental ways of life. So yeah, I do think that should exist and it could exist. But a lot of people have opinions on that. So it's taken a while to figure out the right way to do it.
Wasn't there a case in the last few years in Ukraine of a power company being shut down for an extended period of time by I believe it was attributed to Russia, but attribution in itself is a is a dark art, to say the least.
Magic, but yeah, twice, 2015
yeah,
and 2016.
yeah,
There were major blackouts in Kiev, Ukraine that were a result of cyber attacks. Yeah,
exactly. James.
So I'm just going to add a couple of things onto everything Selena's saying, which is fantastic. So I could just sit here and listen. So I'm very much enjoying this, right? But I guess I probably should say something given that my video's on. I want to say that I'm part of something called the Hague Program for Cyber Norms. And what these people who do cyber norms research would say, not only should it exist, it already exists, right? In that, like, there are international legal frameworks, there are international norm frameworks that we can apply to cyberspace. It's not somewhere new where we have to reinvent the wheel, we have to refigure how this works. We already have all the necessary material, we just need to apply it in the right way. And it's that application that's really difficult. And what you do see, in questions about critical infrastructure, is you see some level of agreement, right? In the UN, when they have these discussions, they say, yes, we should all protect critical infrastructure, but they don't know exactly what critical infrastructure means. And also, these are voluntary norms, right? They're not international law, they're not binding, right? So when states sign up to this, it's not binding them in a certain way, it's not causing them to do stuff necessarily, it can just be a nice piece of paper. So the question about implementations of norms is really important. The other one I wanted to maybe mention quickly is actually what we're seeing now is an increasingly move by a lot of states to say how they think international law applies to cyberspace, right? In terms of conflict, in terms of out of conflict situations, when espionage carries a risk, when it becomes a intrusion into a state sovereignty, right? And this, I talk to a lot of lawyers as part of this program and international lawyers on this side. And when I talk about sovereignty, it ends up taking an hour itself. So I'm not going to say any more about that now, but what would be really useful is actually having, say, the Gulf states, say the UAE or Bahrain or Saudi Arabia, publish what they think their interpretation of international law in cyberspace is. The UK has done it, the Netherlands has done it, the US has done it, Iran has done it, right? So we have lots of states in the region and out of it saying, here's how we think it works. The more people we can have in that conversation, the more you get to a stable interpretation and start seeing where people disagree and hopefully come to some sort of agreement.
So the school report says could try harder on this. I think
very much so.
Yeah, exactly. But then again, I think what's interesting is everybody knows about the Geneva Convention. It's part of our cultural history. Everybody knows what it means, even if they don't know the details. They know conceptually what it means. It's almost like there needs to be that equivalent, for the internet, for the cyber environment, that actually everybody recognizes.
We just have to be careful that it's focused on what the real harms are, right? So one of the things that Microsoft got a bit of backlash for when it first brought out the Geneva Convention is everyone said, well, this isn't a Geneva Convention because what you're really worried about are things that are going to harm Microsoft.
Yes.
Right? And in what way is Microsoft really the subject that we should be worried about here? Actually, the Geneva Convention was designed to limit injury, violence in war, right? So we need to really focus on what forms of violence, what harms we're concerned about, and look, use yours to do that. That's why Microsoft has now called it the Tech Accord, I believe.
And I think also in that instance, the cyber environment is very much a business focused environment. It's about protecting revenues. It's about protecting the companies themselves. Whereas actually, as you say, the focus should be much more outward looking. And when that time comes, hopefully we'll have something similar.
I would say, though, to that point, I think there should be, the impact on businesses, because what is going to drive people to care about, the impact and consequences of cybersecurity and cyber attacks is the bottom line, frankly. I mean, it would be great to say that businesses will come out and we'll say, okay, yes, we'll sign on to this convention, we'll agree and to put our support to have to support this, encourage others to support this, and et cetera. It's also worth noting too that a lot of the businesses are, the platforms and the services upon which a lot of these things are conducted. So, the cyber operations are conducted on top of, targeting Microsoft products, targeting, the equipment and software. And I think that in order to get governments, get companies, get buy-in from the people that are going to really push this is to say, okay, how does this impact our bottom line? Because these things aren't going to be fundamentally altruistic. Unfortunately, I wish that was the case.
Businesses are people too.
Well, I guess technically at the Supreme Court they are.
They're made of people.
But it's true, right? Like you need to sort of say what are the consequences, not just to people, not just to humanity, but to the stock market, like the businesses.
Exactly.
So I get the criticism, totally fair. But I think that will have to play a role in developing this in order to convince people to adopt it.
Yeah. We are running out of time, and we've got loads of questions which we're not going to get to. So I will apologize in advance, folks. But our next question, maybe this could be quite a short one potentially, from Raymond Termini. Thank you, Raymond. Who are the participants in the cyber war race in the Middle East, and how would you rank them as to their expertise? Well, if this is like a top 5 countdown, I think we might have some disappointed folks ringing in if they don't make the top list. But would anybody like to contribute something here?
I can answer very quickly. It's probably easier to ask who is not in the cyber war race, right?
Okay, yeah.
So, that's one way to look at it, is like, as we said earlier, each state wants to have these technologies. There's no reason for them not to seek them. And so it'd be very hard to draw up a list of who is involved in it. Right? There are always the same countries that are mentioned worldwide, right? So you have Iran, China, Russia, North Korea, the big 4 in the US threat landscape, but there are also lots of others, right? And we should let this sort of big 4 focus drive us away from other actors as well. And I would say as well that the Harvard Belfer Center, I was involved in a publication that did this, it's called the Cyber Power Index, right? So I advised on it. They did try to do this top trumps kind of thing, right? Where they do rate states in terms of their cyber capability. Now, often the criticism is that, well, what do you do with that? Once you have a list of top ones, what are you going to do about it? And that's a very valid question. So I'll just leave it there and say, these lists are out there, but how to use them, policy is still unclear.
And also, who cares? Because if you're attacked, you're attacked. It's almost, especially in the cybersphere, it doesn't matter where it's come from. The fact is that it's happened.
Ooh, attribution.
Attribution. Again, another hour that we could, another half a decade we could talk about there on attribution. Okay, looking at the time, we may get another 2 questions in, but let's see. So from Mark Stanfield, thank you, Mark. As much as China wants to pretend it's a friendly force in the world, how much do you see cyber attacks and intellectual property theft by its Communist Party continuing or expanding in the future? The Middle East is commercially expanding on so many fronts. Green technology comes to mind. Do you see China targeting those emerging developments? Now, again, as part of the research and listening to Richard E. Clarke, he was talking about how actually there was a bit of an impasse during the latter part of the Obama presidency between America and China, which when the reins were handed over, that those agreements kind of fell by the wayside somewhat. But it's certainly interesting how, and this could be again partly cultural, etc., but how China's position in this particular environment. Selena, how would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, certainly. So first of all, I would say the sort of cooling of efforts, I would say that is certainly from an American perspective. That's not to say, if talking from a more global scale, the activity by Chinese actors is certainly ongoing. I do want to kind of note real quick, just because Dragos does not do attribution. So speaking from separate research and stuff, there is the Belt and Road Initiative is a massive undertaking by China, and it is involving multiple countries from multiple different continents. And it is essentially trying to become a sort of dominant infrastructural power in many different regions. And what we're seeing is a lot of the IP theft and a lot of the sort of information gathering and espionage operations are kind of going to support sort of this Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of the sort of advanced technological developments that they have going on there, a lot of sort of, construction, transportation, technology, sorts of companies. And what you're seeing, certainly when it comes to the Middle East, is more development discussion there, partnering with China, partnering with other organizations involved in the Belt and Road Initiative. And so from the perspective of China, it is entirely possible, right, that they want to target any sort of entity or organization that may benefit them, that they want some of this technology. And what's pretty interesting is if you look at Department of Justice indictments, again, from an American perspective, DOJ indictments, throughout the course of the last couple of years, you've seen a number of Chinese state-associated actions targeting multiple different countries, from manufacturing to electrical engineering to automotive, transportation, video games, which is kind of unrelated, but still in there, robotics, things like this. You're kind of seeing all of these theft to support these sort of infrastructure development and entities that China has got going on. So it's been pretty interesting to see. I personally am it's kind of a personal interest of mine to sort of track and follow this stuff. So no, I do not see it going anywhere. James.
Just really quickly to see if we can fit in another question. I think the Middle East perspective on this is fascinating, right? And it is different from the conversation in the US, especially on the trade-off in terms of economic benefits, Chinese investment in terms of ports, infrastructure, whether it's green energy, oil, all these different flanks of the economic relationship, and also the threats and risks they introduce in terms of 5G, in terms of adoption of Huawei. There's a very particular conversation going on in the US that is not replicated in the same way in the Gulf states. And being aware of those different, seeing their different perspective, maybe moving more away from the US in kind of these technologies is a really fascinating trend.
Absolutely. Okay, one last question as James threw the gauntlet down there for me to squeeze a question into 2 minutes. So looking at this one, probably the best one to ask, again, from Raymond Termini. Again, thank you, Raymond. Is there a role for private industry in cyber crisis and security management? One word answers need only apply, it seems.
James, did you want to go first?
Sure, I'll start. Yes. But I think that I think Selena will probably be able to speak far more eloquently on this. So I would say yes, private industry should be involved. As we say, the infrastructure is private. There's no escaping it. But really recognizing also sometimes that private industry doesn't always act on economic motives. Sometimes they act on national security motives. Hopefully, sometimes they also act on value-based or human rights motives as well. So private is definitely got a role, but their characteristic could be understood better.
Yes.
Yes, agreed. Well done. Well said. I am biased, obviously, as I work in private industry, and we would love it if
wish to remain employed.
Yeah. But there is, I think a great example of the value of companies sort of assisting in government cyber response is SolarWinds. FireEye and Microsoft have been really on the forefront of coming out with the information and identification of these activities of this massive supply chain compromise attack. And they have been sort of sharing information, collaborating with industry partners, collaborating with government partners to say, okay, here's what we know and here's how we can, fix this. And certainly I think that there is a lot of motivation there. And I will point out really quickly, if we're talking about, the sort of government's response and ability to combat cyber operations, if we think about the government investment in offensive versus defensive, I think that there's a lot to be kind of said there for the opportunity to sort of put more money into these defensive sides of things to help secure, federal government organizations, to help secure, even private companies, right? Like CISA does a ton of work on incident response and working with the private sector to be like, improve security, improve the sort of cyber capabilities that they have to defend themselves. So yes, is your answer. And hopefully we'll see a lot more of that moving forward in the next 4 years.
Absolutely, I agree. And I think certainly something that one of the key things that's come out of the SolarWinds and the FireEye attacks in the last few days is, frankly, the unprecedented level of transparency that both companies have shown in actually what's happened, how it's happened, and the fact that actually everybody can learn this, because this isn't just, an attack on, say, a competitor or an attack on, another company. Actually, this is something that will affect everybody. And if we can all learn from this, everybody benefits as a result. So that unprecedented level of transparency and honesty, I think, can only be applauded.
I always, that metaphor of like a rising tide lifts all boats. I think that really does apply in cyber defense. 100%.
Absolutely. Or herd immunity, as I often call it, but perhaps not the best analogy to use right now. But anyway, Selena, thank you so much for your commentary, analysis, and expert opinion. James, thank you so much for yours as well. I very much appreciate it. Thank you also to the Middle East Institute for arranging this panel. And perhaps more importantly to our audience, who I've seen, well, an amazing level of participation. Thank you very much. You put all of my research, well, it's been wasted, frankly. But thank you. I'm glad that we've been able to answer most of your questions, not all of them, I'm afraid. It's been really enjoyable. And thank you all very much, and have a wonderful rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Feel free to reach out if you have more.
Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, yes, that.